The moon, remote, mysterious, and always just beyond our reach. But there came a time when America's destiny was to send men to the moon.
We shall send to the moon a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall.
A president laid down a challenge to his countrymen.
Made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion.
The Saturn V was America's mightiest rocket. It was the vision of one man, Wernher von Braun. Two American presidents, Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, trusted him, admired him, and came to believe in his dream.
For countless ages, men had dreamed a trip to the moon, but no one had been able to go there except in his imagination. Like Lindbergh's flight, it will inspire us to push deeper and deeper into space until the solar system becomes our neighborhood.
Wernher von Braun had been dreaming of sending men into space since he was a boy. The space capsule he drew then had an uncanny resemblance to the Apollo 11 spacecraft. They were both designed with protective shields, oxygen supplies, and propulsion systems. He was born into the German aristocracy in 1912. His mother arranged for him to study music with Germany's greatest composer, Paul Hindemith. But his younger brother, Magnus, remembers that Wernher von Braun's imagination was elsewhere.
He took a traditional little red wagon and put a bunch of rockets on the back of it and turned them loose on a street in Berlin. And the damn thing went and ended up in somebody's front yard.
Back in Germany in the late 20s, there was a great deal of rocketry going on. Fritz von Opel, the famous Opel, the Opel car magnate, a man named Max Valier, and several others were putting rockets on anything in those days.
The young Wernher was apprenticed to Hermann Oberth, the father of German rocketry. From Oberth's book, Rockets into Interplanetary Space, he learned that space travel was as much about mathematics as imagination.
I was appalled by the fact that it was filled with mathematical equations, and at that time neither math nor physics were exactly my strengths at school, so I went to my math teacher and asked him what I could do to understand this book, because I really wanted to understand whether it was possible to build such rockets.
It was going to take more than mathematics, more than imagination. It was going to take vast amounts of money.
Wernher von Braun began to see the handwriting on the wall, and he confided with some of his colleagues that we've got to do something more than just this amateur business of trying to raise a little money here and a little money there.
In the spring of 1932, he met Captain Walter Dornberger, the officer in charge of the German Army's new rocket program. Dornberger needed someone with vision, enthusiasm, and talent, and he hired von Braun. The young man welcomed the opportunity, even though it meant building weapons.
Von Braun knew if you want to get something going in the technology field, aviation, rocketry, it has to be done with the support of the government or the military. I don't think he, as a young lad, was really articulating a philosophy that we might articulate today, that there was something good or bad about seeking government support for your dream.
3 months after von Braun went to work for the army, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany.
My father was in the cabinet as Minister of Agriculture when Hitler came in. And on the 30th of January, my father came home and he said, "This is the end of Germany." Very somber. And we all shook in our boots.
At Peenemünde, a remote peninsula 115 miles north of Berlin on the Baltic Sea, von Braun's dream was becoming reality. As part of Germany's arms build-up in the 1930s, the Army and Air Force had built the most advanced rocket research and development center in the world. Under his supervision, thousands of designers and technicians planned the top-secret installation, including a highly sophisticated wind tunnel, metallurgy shops, and launch facilities, all needed to create the A4 rocket, brainchild of Peenemunde's 25-year-old technical director. Until the Army hired von Braun, the military had been working with primitive, solid propellant rockets.
In a solid rocket, once you've lit it, it's uncontrollable. You have to expend the entire charge. You just light them and they fire and that's it. The German amateur people had come to the conclusion that if you really want to go into space, you need a liquid propellant rocket. Liquids, of course, you can control the thrust. You can let in more or less liquid as you can in your car, for example. You can accelerate a car or deaccelerate a car, depending on how much fuel you allow to go through your motor. So the Germans developed this missile, which eventually became the A4, had to develop an entire new system of combustion, of thrust control, of guidance. How are you going to guide this missile? Is it going to be radio guided or is it going to be inertially guided with gyroscopes? It was really the development of a brand new technology almost from scratch.
Their attention was focused on rockets. But von Braun and other top administrators working on these weapons programs could not ignore the pressure of politics. To remain in his job, von Braun joined the Nazi Party in 1938. 18 months later, he received an officer's commission in the SS. It's believed that the only time he put on his uniform was the day SS Chief Heinrich Himmler visited Peenemünde. In March 1939, Hitler met von Braun and Dornberger at the old Army rocket development facility at Kummersdorf to observe engine tests.
You know, normally people were impressed by the noise, but he didn't say a word. And then we showed him a model of the E3, you know, with gyroscopes and all these things, and he listened quietly to my explanations, and at the end he turned away shaking his head. So I had the distinct impression that he felt that thing will never work, or a crazy idea or something like that.
Hitler's invasion of Poland came 6 months later. Von Braun and his team were forced into a wartime schedule, working day and night to solve the design problems of the A4. Konrad Dannenberg joined the von Braun rocket team as a propulsion expert.
When I got to Peenemünde in 1940, the engine didn't work too well. Whenever we pushed the start button, normally the thing blew up. And we found out later that you just had too many pounds of propellants in the rocket engine.
The Germans had a great problem with cooling that combustion chamber so that it didn't get too hot and then burn through. You had to develop a system of controlling the amount of propellants that you were injecting at any one time. And you had to make sure that the structure was such that the payload would reach the target 150 or 200 miles away.
To achieve a range of 200 miles, the A4 had to reach an altitude of 50 miles, which would make it the first man-made object to enter space. Von Braun and his team kept working towards a successful launch.
I was watching through a pair of binoculars, and I just kept my fingers crossed that I wouldn't all of a sudden see a fireball in the sky, and finally made it. This day would be remembered as the day when spaceflight was born.
He was in seventh heaven because it was his baby, let's face it, you know, whether it was a weapon or a spacecraft. It was his baby, and he was happy that they had finally overcome all of the shortcomings.
In 1943, American and British bombers began round-the-clock raids on German cities. Ernst Stullinger was transferred from the German army to the von Braun team at Peenemünde.
Only then Hitler began to look around for other means to win the war. And then somebody told him there is that rocket in Peenemünde and that may be our wonder weapon.
In July 1943, von Braun and Dornberger showed Hitler film of successful A-4 launches. The Führer demanded mass production of 2,000 missiles per month. Nazi propagandists renamed it the V2, the vengeance weapon. But throughout that summer, Allied reconnaissance had been photographing the secret rocket facility. In the early morning of August the 18th, nearly 600 British bombers attacked. Walter Thiel, von Braun's top propulsion expert, was amongst those killed. Soon afterwards, the Germans moved production of the V2 underground to the Mittelwerke, an abandoned mine in the Harz Mountains. Nearby, the SS set up the Nordhausen network of forced labor camps. Dora was the largest. 30,000 prisoners, mostly POWs, assembled V2s in the cold, damp tunnels. 10,000 of them died. Von Braun was accused of participating in the use of slave labor. He denied it. Later, he would say, "Even if Dornberger and I had resigned, we would not have helped the prisoners. Himmler would have given orders to continue." In September 1944, German forces began firing von Braun's V2 against London and Antwerp. When the war ended 8 months later, more than 3,000 V2s had been launched, causing much devastation. They killed nearly 3,000 people and seriously injured 6,000. But they did little to alter the course of the war.
In January of 45, the military situation in Germany had deteriorated to the point where we could hear the Russian guns in the distance, and it was pretty obvious that we were confronted with a choice either to evacuate immediately and move west, or to wait for the Red Army to roll over.
Wernher von Braun called together his top echelon and said, "Chaps, we're going to have to leave. We're going to have to evacuate the base, but we do not want to evacuate the base helter-skelter. We want to keep our organization intact." So they began the evacuation towards the end of February by barge, by truck, by train. They moved their personnel out of Peenemünde.
The advancing Russians and Americans were well aware of the V2. Finding its developers was a top priority. The Americans recovered V2 parts for 100 missiles and shipped them back to the States before the Russians occupied the Mittelwerke factory. But von Braun could not be found.
Von Braun himself, Dornberger, von Braun's brother, Magnus, ended up in a little town called Oberjoch, and they were in an inn called the Haus Ingeborg, very close to the Austrian border.
In the midst of all this, I was also involved in an automobile accident and broke my left arm, so I was hospitalized. It was a pretty confusing situation.
And he called together his top directors and said, "Okay, fellas, what are we going to do? We have 4 options. Be captured by the Russians, be captured by the British, be captured by the French, or be captured by the Americans."
We don't want to be captured by the French. They wouldn't know what to do with us. They haven't got any money. They're not interested in this kind of thing. We want to become Americans.
Von Braun's V2 team surrendered to the U.S. Army. After the Second World War, the U.S. transferred Wernher von Braun's rocket team members to Fort Bliss in Texas. There was some resentment that the Germans were brought over before American soldiers were returned home. One congressman complained, "Why do we have to know more about rockets? Send the Germans home and bring our boys back instead." Milton Rosen was following V2 developments for the Navy.
We didn't even know whether they would stay in this country. Technically, they were brought over as prisoners of war. And that was their status when I met von Braun at Fort Bliss.
They were called not prisoners of war, they called themselves prisoners of peace. But they were really a war trophy. They came over not only the brain power. It was as if the entire Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra and its director had come over, not just the director.
Our rooms were quite primitive, but we came from war-torn Germany, and for us everything was freedom and fine. So we did not mind the simple housing. We even did not mind that we were not allowed to go out. We were kept behind the fence of the camp.
But the wire fencing could not keep von Braun from exercising his imagination in the desert nights.
Von Braun was always a dreamer. His basic aim in life was to develop rocketry for the conquest of space. Step one was obviously setting up for him a space station, a big space station in orbit around the Earth. Step two was to get onto the moon. But his real dream was the planet Mars, and he began to compose a rather complete treatise as to how man might eventually reach Mars.
At White Sands in New Mexico, the Army launched more than 70 V-2s to study the upper atmosphere at the frontier of space. The Germans were about to teach the Americans all they knew about rocketry.
Not very many of us knew much of anything. What we knew was specialized. Some people may know trajectory, some may know a little propulsion, but nobody knew it altogether. Von Braun, when you talk to him, you realize you're talking all facets of the subject, because he knew trajectory, he knew guidance, he knew propulsion, he knew everything there was. And we were all amazed at how friendly he was.
He was a typical Prussian attitude. Very stiff-necked, hard to get to know. He had his armor on all the time. But you had to respect him. He was a very capable guy.
About 4 years we spent marking time. We went through all of the programs and all of the designs and all of the facilities, but it did not do very much toward advancing the state of the art.
In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb.
That changed the entire panorama, and those voices who were against bringing the Germans over here were suddenly silenced. We need the Germans. We got a new enemy out there.
The facilities at White Sands and Fort Bliss were too limited to accommodate the Army's expanding rocket program and von Braun's vision. In 1950, his team and their new American colleagues were transferred to Huntsville in Alabama.
Huntsville in those days was a small southern cotton town whose main claim to fame was the watercress capital of the world. The main reason the Army offered us Huntsville is that adjacent to Huntsville there is Redstone Arsenal, a vast expanse of nothing at that time. It was right on the Tennessee River with unlimited electrical and water resources.
Once they got there, the development of a follow-on to the V-2 began. That was the genesis of the Redstone missile. They wanted a beefed-up second-generation V-2 battlefield missile with a range of maybe a couple hundred miles, very, very accurate, that could carry a nuclear warhead.
The von Braun team was adapting the V-2 to America's needs during the Cold War and adapting themselves to life in America.
When the German scientists came in from Fort Bliss, I think they were very delighted over the geography, the mountains of Huntsville. I was in Huntsville High, and these people from Germany were coming in, these young people that were my age, and there was one thing for sure, they were a lot smarter than we were.
Von Braun had married a German cousin, Maria, and they were raising a family in America. Von Braun became an active member of the Huntsville community. He helped the high school astronomy club build an observatory.
As a citizen here, you feel part of the community, and you have some civic projects to work with. And they got together with some of the musical talent here in Huntsville and formed the very first symphony orchestra.
Life in America suited the transplanted Germans. In 1955, they became United States citizens.
We basically had made the decision already in Fort Bliss before we moved to Huntsville, so there was no question for me. I wanted to stay here, I wanted to become a citizen, and I wanted to continue to work with von Braun on real space vehicles.
Von Braun and his commander at Redstone Arsenal, General Holger Toftoy, successfully launched the Redstone rocket in 1953. When General John Bruce Madaris joined Redstone Arsenal as head of the new ballistic missile agency, von Braun was still hoping to use rockets for space travel.
Von Braun was very, very clear that this missile can do more than serve as a battlefield missile. He said this can serve again as the first stage of a space launcher, which in those days meant a vehicle that could place a satellite in Earth orbit.
Von Braun was very good at next step, and General Madaris was quite concerned that is he working so much on the next step of getting to the moon, he's not doing what we're supposed to be doing. So we had an office called Control Office, and I had about 6 or 8 captains who worked down with von Braun to keep an eye on what he was doing. We didn't try to stop him very much, but it was the only way to keep up with what he was doing.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
When Sputnik went up, I think we all collectively blew our tops, because we had known for some time we had the capability of putting an object in space.
There was simply a decision made in Washington by President Eisenhower that the military carrier, the Redstone, if you please, was inappropriate for a civilian-type satellite. Lord, the Russians had no such hesitations.
Von Braun's Army team was competing with Milton Rosen's Navy team to put the first American satellite into orbit. Both went to the Pentagon seeking approval and funding from the Department of Defense.
Von Braun went first. We were allowed to sit in on each other's presentation. Spoke for 4 hours. And I was shaking my head the whole time. He's going to lose them. And I decided right then and there that I was only going to talk for 25 minutes. And that powerful German approach of just trying to overpower them with the validity of what he was saying.
Milton Rosen's Navy team was selected and began work immediately on the Vanguard launch vehicle and its satellite payload.
The Vanguard is a relatively complicated, very efficient, I have to admit, 3-stage launch vehicle. And of course, to develop such a complicated system takes some time. And you have to count on some mishaps, mislaunchings, and that's what happened to the early Vanguard launchings.
I don't want to say we told you so, but that's exactly how we felt. And we said, and we also felt that it was a mischance, that we had the capability, we had the competence, and we could have done it.
General Madaris and von Braun now got the go-ahead for their proposal to use a Redstone booster.
I promised the Secretary of the Army that we would be ready in 90 days or less. Let's go, Wernher.
Madaris always claimed we did it all in 90 days. But they really had only to dust off the vehicle, to check out everything again, to take it to the launch site and to finally launch it.
Von Braun announced, "We have firmly established our foothold in space. We will never give it up again."
We cannot and will not ever get into this race as we should, so long as all of our objectives are short-term objectives. We need a 10 to 12-year program that has as its ultimate goal the manned domination of space. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
The Army was very anxious to extend its role into space, and was already proposing all Army programs to develop bases on the moon. The Department of Defense had started funding a large booster, which became the Saturn I, which was built around bundling together 8 Redstone missile tanks around a central core of a Jupiter missile tank. And that was called, von Braun had a nickname for that, Cluster's Last Stand. It was a cluster of missiles. And it would develop about 1.5 million pounds of thrust, a huge advance over a 75,000-pound thrust of a Redstone. So this is a big step forward.
The Saturn I booster was followed by the 2-stage Saturn 1B. Then came the giant 3-stage Saturn V, the rocket that was to take men to the moon. It dwarfed all other American rockets, delivering 5 times the thrust of the Saturn I. But the Army's dream of dominating space proved illusory. In October 1958, President Eisenhower created a new civilian agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Eisenhower knew that the rivalry between the Army, Navy, and Air Force missile teams would be counterproductive. More importantly, he didn't want space to be militarized.
Wernher said, well, now at last we're on the right track, you know. Obviously, he never expected that the armed forces would give up their interest in it. But the fact that NASA was finally approved as a separate entity and with a separate objective was very much down his alley.
Von Braun was disappointed that Ike was not more of a space cadet. Ike was very reserved about space. He knew he had to do something about it. On the other hand, he did not take kindly to some of the proposals coming out from the von Braun team about going onto the moon and things like that.
Von Braun began to attract criticism.
Don't say that he's hypocritical. Say rather that he's apolitical. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun.
One of Tom Lehrer's songs, for example, is a clever line that's very blatantly untrue. He said that when the rockets go up, who cares where they came down? He cared mightily. He wanted the rockets to go up and get to the moon and beyond. But I don't think of Wernher as a warrior. I think the mainstream of his dreaming was to make sure we were spacefaring people and that America was a spacefaring nation.
He wrote a series of articles for Collier's magazine, proposing the manned exploration of the moon and Mars. He took part in 3 television programs produced by Walt Disney. By 1960, proposals for ambitious space missions were being widely debated. President Kennedy took note.
He sent a memo to his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, and he asked a number of questions. What are we doing in space? What can we do to beat the Russians? What are the options out there? And Vice President Johnson turned around and asked for some advice and opinions from others. And one of those others was Wernher von Braun, who responded about a week later, "Dear Mr. Vice President, we have a sporting chance," and those are the words he used, "a sporting chance of beating them to place a 3-man capsule around the moon, and we have an excellent chance of beating them to place astronauts on the surface of the moon." And then he added, and of course, bringing them back.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
All across the country, President Kennedy explained his goal of putting Americans on the moon, which he had first announced to Congress on the 25th of May, 1961.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
People said, my God, this is happening, you know, because we didn't know in advance just what Kennedy was going to say to Congress, but there was also euphoria that, my God, it's happened. We're on the way.
The president toured Huntsville to see if the rocket team could deliver what von Braun had promised. Ed Buckby was von Braun's information officer at NASA during the 1960s.
I think the leadership that Kennedy provided was very important to establish a goal, which we needed to do it in a certain time frame, and to know that he had the confidence in the team that we could bring it off. You could see the sparkle in Kennedy's eye, and you could see the chemistry that he liked von Braun. and von Braun liked Kennedy. When we got down to the giant hangar where these rockets were assembled, Kennedy was totally absorbed in this man and the message. You could see he was hanging on every word. Well, during this discussion, there was this second discussion going on behind Kennedy. They were arguing about how we're going to do it. Well, finally, Kennedy turns around and said, "What's the problem?" And someone stepped forward and said, "Well, Mr. President, we do have some debate about the proper way to do this."
There was an enormous debate about the mission mode, whether there were three possible mission modes: direct flight, Earth orbit rendezvous, and lunar orbit rendezvous. Von Braun favored the Earth orbit rendezvous.
A Saturn V would be launched into Earth orbit and remain there as a kind of primitive space station. A second Saturn V would be launched into orbit, refueled by the first, and then carry its crew onto the moon. The space station was crucial to von Braun's vision of the future in space. Lunar orbit rendezvous was a second alternative. The Saturn V would propel a space capsule into orbit around the moon to serve as a base for the astronauts, before they descended to the lunar surface and returned. A third approach was direct flight in a rocket big enough to take men straight to the moon and bring them back. It took 1 million man-hours to decide which approach to use. Giant rockets and space stations could not be built within Kennedy's time frame. Von Braun knew he would have to postpone his dream of traveling to Mars. In the weeks before Kennedy's visit to Huntsville, von Braun agreed to the second alternative, that of a lunar orbit rendezvous.
So Kennedy turned to von Braun and said, "Dr. von Braun, can we go to the moon this way?" And von Braun looked at Kennedy and said, "Mr. President, we can go to the moon as we've described, and we can do it within the time frame you said." His vision, always looking to the future and causing people that work for him to believe we could do it. He really got to me. He convinced me that we were going to go to the moon, and he knew how to do it. And he knew how to build a rocket that would take us to the moon. Watching in the test stand area 2,000 feet away and watch that monster ignite, all that fire and smoke and thunder come out, and right here you would feel this. You literally felt heat come up your pants leg, and the ground literally shook. And Kennedy did experience that day, that test firing for about 30 seconds of a Saturn I, but he never got to see the big moon rocket tested, nor did he get to see a Saturn launch. When he was assassinated, von Braun was totally devastated. In fact, everyone in the NASA family felt like that, the guy who really gave us a purpose was gone.
Von Braun redoubled his own efforts to persuade Americans to support space travel. And he succeeded.
Number one, he had a lot of charisma. But number two, he had a very convincing selling capability. He single-handedly sold the United States Congress on spaceflight, let's face it.
In fact, many people believe that we have produced more scientific knowledge with our smaller vehicles than the Russians have with their much larger ones.
Do you share that opinion?
In the scientific field, yes, sir. But I believe the Russians still have an edge on us in the payload capability.
He was great with Congress. The Democrats controlled the Congress, and the good Southern Democrats were the ones that could relate to Wernher very well.
The people in Washington would come to Huntsville. They would visit what they called von Braun's rocket factory. And they wanted to kick the tires. They wanted to see the fire and smoke. The congressmen that were involved in this program, that were appropriating millions of dollars, wanted to hear from von Braun personally, how we doing? Do you have everything you need? Are we going to make this thing work?
Disaster struck on the 27th of January in 1967. 3 Apollo 1 astronauts were killed in a launch pad fire.
Many people thought that the tragedy of Apollo 1 would be the end of the American space program. And that would have been a great disservice to the memory of the people we lost. My belief is that Wernher knew, again, his sense of the inevitability of our moving ahead in space, that would only be a momentary setback and would probably contribute to the safety of future astronauts.
Ignition sequence start.
Less than 2 years after the Apollo 1 tragedy, von Braun's Saturn V put 3 Apollo 8 astronauts into orbit around the moon.
51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
There's a marvelous picture that was taken just after Apollo 8 took off, and you had Wernher and I both looking extremely pleased. Quite a wonderful occasion.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Von Braun had shown that the launch vehicle can carry the payload to the moon. Frank Borman at that time could not land on the moon because the lunar lander was not ready. But it had been shown, it had been demonstrated that it's possible to get to the moon.
Apollo 8 was a watershed mission. Coming off of the Apollo fire, it gave the whole organization a tremendous boost in morale. It made it possible to carry out Apollo 11 on the schedule we did.
But the mission to the moon would face more problems, right up to the moment of landing. Kennedy had issued his famous challenge to his countrymen. On a beautiful summer night in 1969, America prepared to meet that challenge.
Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and then finally Mike Collins. Right on time as far as the astronaut countdown is concerned. The prime crew now depends.
It was really very exciting to be at the Kennedy Space Center in the very early morning hours. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark, but the flares were all directed upon the Saturn launch vehicle. It was some sort of an eerie feeling.
As day broke, tens of thousands descended upon the Cape, now named after President Kennedy. They came from every state and every walk of life.
There was just euphoria in the stands. I mean, it was the apotheosis of a lifetime of fascination. Even in my high school yearbook, a little notation that Fred Ordway is the guy who wants to go to the moon. So for somebody like me, it was an incredible experience.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting. Power transfer is complete.
It was very amazing that he did not seem to be nervous. I think he had the feeling we did everything we could. We had enough backups for all the emergencies.
Guidance is internal. Good luck and Godspeed.
Von Braun's rocket lifted away flawlessly. 3 men were on their way to the moon. Apollo 11 hurtled out of the Earth's orbit at nearly 25,000 miles per hour. The 240,000-mile trip would take 3 days. Now in lunar orbit, The astronauts separate the Eagle lunar lander from the Columbia space capsule and begin the descent to the moon.
0572.
Von Braun is an observer at Mission Control in Houston.
Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand, go for landing, 3,000 feet.
The Eagle, commanded by Neil Armstrong, is on automatic pilot.
Go, 2,000 feet, 2,000 feet.
Just below 2,000 feet, things go wrong.
1201, Roger, 1201 alarm.
The alarm, 1201, means that the lunar lander's computer is overloaded. Everyone in the room, including Von Braun, realize that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are in danger.
Stand by for go flight. Okay, we're go.
Armstrong's pulse races to 160 beats per minute.
540 feet and a 15.
Armstrong overrides the computer. He takes control himself and manually steers the Eagle into position for the final touchdown. A crater 80 feet across looms into view.
Forward. Forward.
He has to find a smoother landing area, or they'll crash.
Altitude, velocity, light. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Make shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Wernher von Braun and the whole world breathed a sigh of relief.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Okay, I'm going to step off the limb now.
It was like the unbelievable has finally become believable, and through the efforts that we knew of the people that we knew that were working on this, that were making it possible, were our neighbors, our across-the-street neighbors. They were who was making history happen.
We knew that the city of Huntsville was solidly behind us, and with your continued support, I will see you back in orbit with that new space station, to which we will all ride in a reusable launch vehicle, and maybe one day we'll have a man on Mars. Thank you.
After the moon landing, there were great plans to go forward with a lunar base, space station. In fact, the month after our first moon landing, in July 1969, Von Braun appeared before a congressional committee and presented in detail a manned Mars landing plan. And no one was listening.
The lunar colony was supposed to be in place by about 1980, and the Mars colony was supposed to be in place by 1990. So that by the year 2000, we'd have people populating at least the near planets.
There are, of course, many other things competing for public interest. There's an election coming up, and there's a war going on in Vietnam, and there are problems in the cities, and quite a few people seem to believe that we are taking money away from the public purse. We prefer to see our space program in a somewhat different light. We believe that we are actually producing values, and we are producing values at a faster rate than we are taking money out of the treasury.
6 Apollo missions landed on the moon between 1969 and 1972, but von Braun would not be based in Huntsville for all of them. He was transferred to NASA headquarters in Washington in February 1970.
My friends, there was dancing here in the streets of Huntsville when our first satellite orbited the Earth. And there was dancing again when the first Americans landed on the moon. I'd like to ask you, don't hang up your dancing slippers.
It was like parting with a family member. We didn't want to see him leave. We didn't want him to leave Huntsville. And it was very painful to think that he was going to leave, and we were hoping that he'd soon be back. But of course, he didn't return.
2 years later, von Braun left NASA for private industry. The moon program was dismantled. Many members of the original German rocket team retired. In 1975, Wernher von Braun was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 63. He died in 1977. In the whole history of rocketry, only one series have never failed: Wernher von Braun's Saturn rocket. But no one is going to the moon anymore. Von Braun's rockets lie like dinosaurs in a museum, relics of a challenge long ago mastered and now, it seems, almost forgotten.
Saturn V is the largest.
I think Wernher's legacy generally is that he opened up the skies to us in more ways than one in terms of space exploration and in terms of making use of our own capabilities here on Earth. His last desire was to have satellites over developing countries that could teach children by satellite.
Von Braun had that fixation of an idea that he wanted to realize in his lifetime, and he devoted his entire life to that end.
I'm just grateful that he lived to see the triumph of the Apollo program, making it to the moon and back with several teams. Wernher had the satisfaction of almost everything that he dreamed about except going into space himself.
He should have felt fulfilled and realized his dream. Nobody else in the world had been more responsible for that man on the moon than he. He would have gone to all of them if you gave him a chance, and if he had enough time. He was ready to keep on moving. Find the galaxy that's farthest from us and go out there.
I believe with all my heart that the closer man comes to understanding the universe, the closer he comes to understanding himself. And that, after all, may be the greatest gift that can be bestowed upon us, on you and me, on all mankind.